On the 17th of September 2021, Bree Jonson, a Filipino artist, arrived at the Flotsam and Jetsam Resort in San Juan, La Union. By 3:30 in the morning on the 18th, she was dead. At the very onset of this case, the narrative was solidified that this was a suicide, a narrative that would be held on to steadfastly by those who sought to vindicate the only person who was with Bree that morning, Julian Ongpin. This was a narrative that to this day is being furiously rejected by those who love and care for Bree. The following episode, a bonus episode, is a review of what unfolded in the days and months after Bree's death. This is not my usual format, but it is important to remind ourselves not only of what happened 1 year ago, but also that whilst we are not hearing about Bree's case anymore, there still is no resolution and those close to her suffer the effects of her passing still. This is the case of Bree Jonson. Hello, Lagim fam. Despite my current hiatus, I had always planned to do something in honor of Bree's first death anniversary. Now, I've said in the past that I did not feel okay doing an episode on her case because a lot was still ongoing then, and it was all happening very quickly. Putting on an episode when things are still actively unfolding felt like a disservice to her story and her case. But with the PNP and NBI's lack of updates for us and the general lack of movement in the case, I felt that maybe my platform, which has grown considerably since that day when Bree's case first broke out in the news, can be used to remind people that this is still unresolved and very much in danger of becoming a permanent cold case. With Bree's mom's permission and blessing, I've finally been able to produce this episode in the hope that people can be encouraged again to demand accountability from the NBI and PNP. The justice system, as I have pointed out so many times on this podcast in the past, has a way to tire people out because it moves at an incredibly glacial pace. So for me personally, it is important to keep the story alive, to keep the case in people's consciousness, and to keep demanding accountability from those who can help move the needle on this case. As always, some details in this episode may be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourselves whilst listening. I suppose the best way to understand how this case has unfolded so far is to start from the very beginning, the 17th of September. I first heard of Bree's case on the 21st of September through an article in the Philippine Daily Inquirer. In this article, or better said, we, learned that Bree arrived in La Union with her supposed boyfriend Julian Ongpin on the 17th of September at around 8:30 in the evening. According to Bree's mother, Sally Jonson, Bree was planning to put up an art exhibit in December later that year, and her visit to La Union was connected to this plan. Bree informed her mother that most of her paintings had sold out, the proceeds of which would help her set up a studio in La Union. The planned show or art exhibit would take time to prepare, and in the interim, Bree told her mother that she would be staying with a resident artist in La Union who can provide Bree with accommodation for the time being. Now, at around 9 or 10 in the evening of the 17th, both Bree and Julian were picked up by friends. They all went to a bar for drinks, but were then asked by the bar owner to leave at around 11 as the bar was closing due to a curfew. The friend group went to a different bar afterwards only to see that that one had already closed because of the curfew. They all then decided to go to a friend's place also located in La Union. This friend was a DJ from what I understand. The friends drank and listened to music, and the atmosphere was described as being good and relaxed. Those who were with Bree and Ongpin did not notice anything off about the couple. One of them even described the two as being in love or looking like they were in love. This same person, however, conceded that even if something had been off about Ong Bin, he probably would not have been able to notice because he was more focused on talking to Bree. Bree shared with him in this conversation that she was planning to move to La Union, like I have already previously mentioned. Bree expressed the wish to find an apartment and even asked this friend for help. She also shared with him that she would only be staying at the Flotsam and Jetsam resort for one night. This friend also remembered Bree mentioning that she was scheduled to meet a few people the next day, and it may have to do with a visit to the so-called emerging islands. So, having stayed at their DJ friend's place for an hour or so, the group then decided that it was time to go. At this point, it was around midnight. Both Bree and Ong Bin were dropped back at the Flotsam and Jetsam resort. Nothing stood out to the friend who dropped them off, so there was no cause to worry. It would then seem that both Bree and Ong Bin were still awake around this time and proceeded to drink for a couple of hours, as shown by CCTV footage from the resort. This now brings us to the 18th of September. At around 3:30 a.m., Julian Ong Bin was seen rushing to ask for help from resort staff members as Bree had apparently died by suicide in their room's bathroom. The resort staff members would later describe Ong Bin as anxious. Medical responders and the police were then called in. When the medical responders arrived at the scene, they attempted to revive Bree and then rushed her to the nearest hospital, the Ilocos Training and Regional Medical Center. Bree was sadly declared dead upon arrival at the hospital. As for Julian Ong Bin, he was arrested for possession of cocaine because the police found 12.6 grams of cocaine in the couple's resort room. A complaint for violating the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002 was then filed against him. The PNP would also later reveal that upon his arrest, Julian was tested for illicit drugs and he eventually tested positive for having used cocaine. By the 20th of September, most details of what had already taken place in Bree's case were released. We learned that the inquest prosecutor of La Union deemed it proper to conduct a regular preliminary investigation of the case to give police authorities the opportunity to submit additional evidence to further prove the drug possession case against Ong Bin and to further seek answers as to whether Bree's death was the result of foul play. Then Justice Secretary Guevara directed the NBI to cooperate with the PNP because the Bureau eventually got involved anyway. It was not clear at this point whether the two agencies would be joining forces or conducting parallel investigations. On this day, we also learned that Miss Sally, Bree's mother, had arrived in Manila and was put into mandatory quarantine for 10 days. We saw how she pleaded with the Bureau of Quarantine for a shorter period of quarantining because she would not be able to attend her own daughter's funeral if she could not get out sooner. She stated that she had already been vaccinated and should be let out earlier. We also learned that an autopsy was conducted this same evening despite it having been scheduled to happen much earlier. Bree's body had to be transferred to a different hospital after authorities found out that her body was placed beside another body that died because of COVID. The pathologist allocated to Bree's case therefore had to be protected, so Bree's body needed to be moved, and this time to the Regional Crime Laboratory, where the PNP took the lead instead of the NBI. Now, there were further complications around the autopsy issue, and I'll try to break it down as much as I can because the reports were sometimes very contradictory in this matter. The allocated pathologist ended up calling in sick, so another pathologist had to be called in to conduct the autopsy. At this point, there was no one to witness the autopsy as per protocol, so a witness had to be found first to do said observation. This witness, who was supposed to be from the NBI, ended up being from very far away, so that person's travel contributed to the overall delay in the autopsy. When I was writing blog post after blog post last year on Bree's case, I've also raised the issue that such a delay in the autopsy could mean more margin for error and more room for possible tampering of evidence. Although we were told that Bree's dad was on site pretty much right after Bree was declared dead on arrival at the hospital, it pretty much still gave me such an uneasy feeling to hear that such a great delay plus a hospital transfer had to be overcome first in order to get this autopsy done. And this brings us to the 21st of September. On this day, Karen Davila interviewed Miss Sally Jonson, who was still in quarantine at this point. Miss Sally explained that she was not aware of Julian being Bree's boyfriend or that Bree would be with him in La Union at all. She denied that Bree used drugs and therefore denied any allegation of an overdose. She said that Bree was very much against drugs when she was alive. However, she did reveal that Bree was taking anti-anxiety medication that was prescribed to her. Miss Sally also denied that her daughter died by suicide or in any way hurt herself. It was simply unlikely because of the plans that Bree had for the future. Whilst all this was happening, on the other side of the country, Ong Pin was released on bail despite being charged with a non-bailable offense. The legislation applicable here is Republic Act 9165, where a mere possession of 10 grams of illegal drugs could warrant life imprisonment or the death penalty if convicted. Nevertheless, Ong Pin was put on an immigration lookout list but not on a holdout order after fears of him potentially leaving the country, as he had or has the means and influence to do so. An immigration lookout list is not as severe or strict as a holdout order, but the DOJ was already considering to issue a holdout order in order to fully stop Ong Pin from leaving the country. Despite having said that they were considering a holdout order, it seemed to me at that point that the DOJ was still very non-committal about the issue, which really bothered me. Now, going back to Miss Sally, we heard on this day that she was sent a picture of her daughter's body and she immediately noticed how Bree had sustained marks or bruises on her neck, specifically around her trachea, that confirmed to her that pressure was put on that area. Miss Sally was leaning towards strangulation as the possible cause for those marks. It was also during this interview with Karen Davila that Miss Sally expressed suspicions about the extent of Julian Ong Pin's involvement. This is because, according to her, Ong Pin initially said that Bree ran into the bathroom and hung herself. He then changed his story significantly and said that he allegedly found Bree on the bed, already lifeless. She then pointed out that when she was sent a copy of Ong Pin's mugshot, she immediately noticed how he looked like he had deep scratches on his face, indicating to her that Bree may have tried to fight off Ong Pin in what could have been an altercation or a fight for her life. Miss Sally also pointed out that there were scratch marks or scratches on Ong Pin's left forearm. When the PNP was asked about this by the media, they said that they did not consider these scratch marks as an indication of a struggle. It would seem that the PNP were told by Ong Pin that he sustained those scratch marks on his arms from forcing his way into the bathroom window where, according to him, Bree was dying. This detail would become the first of many details that would be revealed to us in order to give us a clearer picture of what happened inside that resort room. Miss Sally then went on to say in this interview that she asked her family if a DNA test had been conducted for whatever was found underneath Bree's fingernails, and she was inquiring through her relatives and friends who were with Bree's body at that point if the police had indeed found something. At that point, there were no answers to this question, but as the weeks go on, we would learn a little bit more about this DNA test and other evidence. So I will touch upon them as we go along in this episode. Miss Sally was then asked what she thought had happened in that resort room, and she agreed with a speculation put forward by Davila, as in it was perhaps likely that Ong Pin and Bree had a fight, and Ong Pin ended up hurting Bree so badly that she eventually or suddenly died. Miss Sally said that this theory or speculation may not be too far-fetched, since the staff members at the resort heard noises emanating from the couple's room. To them, the noise sounded very much like people fighting. Later on, the PNP would acknowledge this, but also added that the witnesses at the resort who heard this fight stopped short of categorizing this fight as a lover's quarrel. Now, I do not know what the PNP was trying to say here, but this seemed like hair-splitting to me. Whether a fight can be classified as a lover's quarrel or not does not really take away from the fact that it was a fight. Now, still staying on this interview between Miss Sally and Karen Davila, we learned that Miss Sally, who did not know anything specifically about Julian Ong Pin even after Bree died, said that when she heard about him in connection to Bree, she recognized his last name, of course, as belonging to an affluent Filipino family, but that was it. She did not know anything more. As the days progressed after Bree's death, friends of Bree had talked to Miss Sally apparently and have given her the impression that Julian Ong Pin was a quote-unquote bad boy, which of course was and remains worrying. Now, whilst this was unfolding in the media, many people, especially on the internet, had obviously weighed in on the case, and for them, there were three possible scenarios that could explain Bree's death. Number one, a suicide. Number two, a homicide. And number three, an accidental death by overdose. With the many speculations about the cause of Bree's death also came comments that were rather anti-Bree in nature. The commenters seemed to be blaming Bree for being quote-unquote liberated, which is Filipino speak for a woman who is considered by the largely conservative Filipino society as loose, progressive, easy, perhaps slutty, and definitely not demure. This was the start of a horrible streak of victim blaming that would only get uglier as the days, weeks, and months went on. Meanwhile, some other parts of the internet were worried that with Ong Pin's release, it would be hard to track him should something come up in the investigation or if he needed to be interviewed again. There was no information from the PNP or NBI as to whether he was being surveilled, guarded, or anything at all, leading many to believe that Julian Ong Pin may have leveraged his father's immense wealth and influence to be in such a favorable position despite being charged with a serious drug offense. Now sure, PNP Chief General Guillermo Eleazar reassured everybody that Ong Pin would make himself available for further questioning, but many of us did not have that confidence in the PNP's integrity, especially because no reason was given for Ong Pin's release in the first place. On the 22nd of September, we would learn a few more details in this case. Firstly, we learned that Bree also tested positive for cocaine. We also learned a few things about Bree's initial autopsy findings. We learned that Bree died of asphyxia, but the pathologist allocated to her case, from what we were told at least, still did not declare a cause of death, or better said, the manner of death, whether it was intentional, self-inflicted, or accidental. Meanwhile, we also learned something about the examination of the crime scene. We were told that Bree had a PWD card. For those who don't know what that is, a PWD ID or card is the standard identification card for persons with disability in the Philippines. It's issued by the Persons with Disability Affairs Office or the City or Municipal Social Welfare and Development Office. Bree carried this card because she had a diagnosis of anxiety and depression. It is my understanding that for the purposes of having a PWD card, both anxiety and depression are considered a psychosocial disability, and that's why Bree was entitled to have one. I'm not too keen about the term psychosocial disability, but I understand that is the term being used in the Philippines. Also, it bears repeating that just because somebody has anxiety or depression does not mean they are automatically suicidal. Now, it was also on this day that Karen Davila interviewed then Police Regional Officer Director Emmanuel Peralta about Ong Pin's bail release. When Davila pointed out how someone could be released on bail when charged with a non-bailable offense, Peralta struggled to answer, simply repeating that it was a decision made by the prosecutor's office in La Union. In other interviews, he would repeat this over and over again, even saying that his agency has no power against such a decision by the prosecutor. Fair enough. Now, just to clarify here, the prosecutor in La Union decided that there was no reason to hold Ong Pin further because his case was apparently not proper for inquest proceedings because his arrest did not fall under any of the instances where warrantless arrest is allowed. Now, you're probably squinting at whatever you're looking at right now and scratching your head at the same time because what I just said did not make any sense to you, and I would agree. It did not make any sense to me initially, so I had to go back and actually learn what it all meant. And I'm going to try to break it down for you and explain it in the simplest of ways. And if I happen to be wrong and a criminal lawyer from the Philippines is listening to this, please drop me a DM or an email, and I would gladly issue a correction in my next episode. So, a person can be arrested without a warrant if they were caught committing a crime or have already committed a crime or was about to commit a crime. A normal citizen or a police officer is therefore empowered and allowed to do such an arrest and hold the arrested person in remand for a certain period of time depending on the crime that we're talking about. If a fairly minor crime was committed or was about to be committed, for example, the perpetrator can only be held in jail after the arrest for 12 hours. If after 12 hours no case is filed against the person, he, she, or they need to be released. If someone was arrested on a weekend and no one is there to decide whether a case needs to be filed or not, a duty prosecutor or fiscal is always there to then decide if this matter needs further investigation. This summary or informal investigation is called an inquest. The duty prosecutor determines if an extended stay in jail is needed until such time a proper case can be filed. Now, with everything that I've said so far, you would think that the warrantless arrest was very much valid and called for because we are talking about drug possession in Ong Pin's case. But for some inexplicable and perplexing reason, the La Union prosecutor's office did not agree with us. And so, Julian Ong Pin was released, even though, as we now know, the crime with which he was charged is a non-bailable offense. Still, the prosecutor thought that an inquest was not appropriate, and instead, the PNP should just be given enough time to conduct a proper and formal investigation. I mean, fair enough, but the risk taken here was huge because I feel like Julian Ong Pin was very much the picture of a flight risk. Why take that step? Why take that risk, knowing the alleged perpetrator has the means to flee the country? So, that is the warrantless arrest and inquest issue in a nutshell, and I do hope that makes sense. Now, let's go back to our timeline where we are still on the 22nd of September. On this day, Police Regional Officer Director Emmanuel Peralta would also comment on the many criticisms raised about the delay in conducting an autopsy on Bree's body. He quickly stated that the delay was not really the fault of anybody within the NBI or the PNP. He pointed out that police authorities were waiting for Bree's parents to make a decision about the autopsy, that Bree's father initially insisted, apparently, that the autopsy should be performed by the NBI, but then later allowed the PNP to do it. Now, it's obvious that the director wanted to put all the blame on Bree's parents. However, he also conveniently ignored the fact that the delay in the autopsy was so substantial that surely it could not only be attributed to Bree's parents. Now, I concede that relatives of victims need to consent to an autopsy. That is standard procedure. But I have a feeling that the decision was made sooner rather than later by Bree's parents, and not quite how it was portrayed or implied by director Peralta. But of course, I could be wrong. It was also on the 22nd of September that at least one report came out that quoted someone from the PNP who released information about how Bree's body supposedly did not show any signs of struggle. I wrote in my blog back then that within just a few days, so many things were being made public by mainly the PNP that seemed to favor the suicide angle, but there were also still so many missing details that up to this day we're still not privy to. In this report, the PNP elaborated and said that there were no signs on Bree's back, feet, the front part of her body, and her hands. Only her neck showed ligature marks. They explained that those marks came from a so-called cat chain that Bree had possibly used to hurt herself. Again, the PNP was making very early remarks about an investigation that was still ongoing. Even Director Peralta admitted that they were not done yet with the investigation, specifically the histopathology examination. And yet here he was already making remarks as if those remarks were a foregone conclusion. And that conclusion was that Bree died by suicide. Further to this report, we also learned that Bree's body was also examined by the designated SOCO team, or Scene of the Crime Officers team, and they agreed with the findings of the PNP in that they too did not find any signs of a struggle. Amidst all the reports and comments being made about Bree's case and specifically the autopsy results, we also learned that there was a very intimate Zoom gathering with Bree's family and friends. I made it a point to attend that Zoom meeting just to pay my respects, and the details given by some friends who had seen and or talked to Bree days and hours before her death filled in a lot of gaps in the timeline of this case. Now, during this Zoom gathering or Zoom vigil, it was inevitable that Bree's positive drug test was also briefly touched upon. Miss Sally, Bree's mother, offered up the explanation that perhaps the reason why Bree used drugs was that she may have felt the group pressure to do so. She did not, however, believe that Bree was a habitual user, nor was she an addict. She also addressed the suicide angle that had been dogging this case from the very beginning. She candidly admitted that Bree had had suicidal ideations in the past, which was then thought to be the result of her mental health difficulties. Bree, however, seemed to have been the kind of person who dealt with her issues head on. She made it a point to research her mental health issues and eventually went into therapy to address them. Bree was also apparently very religious in the way she took her medication. Furthermore, friends of Bree who were in that Zoom vigil also attested to the fact that they never really thought of Bree as being suicidal, nor did she present as unhinged. In that Zoom call, I also listened to someone who identified himself as being familiar with Julian Ongpin. Although there's no way for me to verify the information that this person shared, I will briefly mention here what he said for the sake of completeness. But please take this information with a grain of salt, and please know that I am now placing a blank allegedly at this point because the next few sentences are things I cannot be sure of. So, Firstly, it was unclear to me what this person's relationship was to Julian Ongpin, but he spoke very surely about how Ongpin was supposedly known to have serious mental health issues and how he can be very violent and abusive, allegedly. He also said that Ongpin was a drug user and was at some point sent to a rehab facility, not only for his drug addiction, but also for his violent tendencies. This behavior seemed to have worsened after his mother's death. This person also shared that Ongpin can be a bit of a quote-unquote schizo. There was no further explanation as to why that is, but he repeatedly said that at least to him, it made sense that Ongpin would hurt Bree. It made less sense that she died by suicide. Now, after this person shared his thoughts, a few people then asked if anybody knew where Ongpin was. Now, although the PNP had said repeatedly that Ongpin had made himself available for questioning more than once after his release, it was never clear where he really was staying. Someone in the Zoom group speculated that he was in Baguio at one of the many family properties owned by his father, but nobody could be sure. Which now brings us to the 23rd of September. If before this day the PNP had not said anything official yet about what they thought Bree's cause of death was, they certainly did on this day. They said that as per the autopsy results, they concluded that Bree likely died by suicide. Bree's family naturally did not want to accept this and asked the NBI to conduct a second autopsy. The complete report and findings of the PNP autopsy was not released on this day, and as we would also learn, Bree's family did not get a copy of their final autopsy results either. We would also learn that actually the NBI had already started their own autopsy at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 22nd, so the day before. No results were announced on this day. Also on the 23rd of September, we heard from the law firm representing Bree's family's interest. The representatives from this law firm sought to correct a few things. Firstly, they stated that Bree's body did show signs of struggle, specifically in the form of bruises. The statement also made it clear that Bree's family had not been given a copy of Julian Ongpin's body examination following his arrest, since I've already mentioned he seemed to have sustained injuries himself. Most importantly, in this statement, we get a glimpse into what the law firm found out about the last minutes of Bree's life. Here is what was included in that statement verbatim. We, together with the PNP and the NBI, already viewed the CCTV footage from the hostel and are already in the process of securing a copy. The management of Flotsam and Jetsam have been very helpful and cooperative. Based on what we saw, Brianna and Julian had a heated altercation minutes before she was found unconscious in their hotel room. The two were in and out of their room for a few minutes before they eventually locked themselves in. Around 20 minutes thereafter, Julian went outside and climbed to the 4th floor. Upon his return, he went inside the room for a few seconds, then went out again to grab a ladder and positioned the same against the wall outside their room, which was the room's comfort room window. He climbed the ladder and removed 3 layers of jalousie. Julian stepped down and paced by the hostel lobby. Julian went inside again their room for about 5 minutes. Thereafter, Julian went down the stairs and a hostel staff came up to open the room with him. Brianna's body can now be seen from the lobby CCTV. Not long after, the incident was reported to the authorities and the police arrived. She was brought to the hospital and declared dead on arrival. The parts of the CCTV footage mentioned in the law firm's statement was made public on this day. It can be seen from the footage that it was not all pleasant between Bree and Julian Ongpin. As mentioned already, the law firm characterized it as a heated altercation. In stark juxtaposition to this strong statement from Bree's family, the PNP also released new information about how they managed to do a reenactment of what supposedly happened to Bree and Julian Ongpin in the early hours of September 18th. Ongpin seemed to have been the sole source of information for this reenactment. Now, it would seem that Ongpin was saying that after seeing Bree hanging in the bathroom, he tried his best to get into the bathroom, releasing her from her hanging position, then placing her onto the bed. The PNP also seemed to have accepted that the injuries on Ongpin's body, pictures of which are available online by the way, were consistent with the story Ongpin had given the PNP. Speaking of this reenactment, on the 24th of September, the PNP released pictures of this activity that they had conducted the day before. It looked like from the pictures that they had asked a woman, a female colleague, who was of the same height and stature as Bree, to stand in and essentially help the police recreate the scene as Ongpin had described it. I have a few more things to say about this reenactment later in the episode, so we'll put a pin on that. In other news on this day still, after having blogged about this case for a few days at that point, I received a message from someone who seemed to have known Bree in a professional capacity. They asked to be anonymous. They also expressed the same things that friends and family of Bree had already expressed about the suicide angle that was at that point dominating the conversation. This friend said that they were aware of the many plans Bree had for the future and simply could not imagine Bree suddenly changing her mind and then hurting herself. The big move to La Union was known amongst Bree's friends and colleagues in the art world, and so the suicide story made little sense. Having received and read that message, I of course began thinking whether the PNP had a solid plan within their investigation to interview those who have known Bree professionally and also those who were close to her in her personal life. It did seem at this point that there was no such plan in place, and this was of course very frustrating for me, and I was only reporting about the case. So just imagine the level of frustration that Bree's friends and family members were feeling at that point. Now, on the 24th of September as well, the law firm representing Bree's family also commented on Ongpin's statements to the police so far about what happened to Bree. To quote attorney Jessely Sunga, Julian initially told the first responder that he found Bree hung inside the CR or comfort room using a bra strap. Then came the news the other day it became a cat chain. And if you look inside the CR, there is no way Bree could have hung herself. There was nothing there that you could hook something into which is strong enough to carry a person. End of quote. It was reiterated that despite the ligature marks on Bree's neck looking like thin lines, the bruises on her body tell more of a story of struggle than suicide. Now, due to the inevitable clash in theories in this case, Bree's family, through their lawyers, said that they would be filing a motion for reconsideration in relation to Ongpin's release, since for them, he was and still is very much a suspect in Bree's death. Now, before I proceed, I want to briefly touch upon this subject about the bra strap and the cat chain. When I was blogging about this case, I did not hear about any bra strap before the 24th of September, and I could see why this specific point was raised by attorney Sunga. So just to reiterate, allegedly Julian Ongpin first said that Bree was hanging from a cat chain, and this later changed to Bree hanging from a bra strap. Of course, this would raise red flags. But of course, there's more. There's always more. We also learned on this day, the 24th of September, that both very important objects, the bra strap and the cat chain, were not even logged in as official evidence in this case. According to Attorney Sunga, there was also a black cloth that could be seen in the crime scene photos she was able to view, but oddly enough, this cloth was not part of the evidence inventory. Of course, we can only speculate as to what this black cloth was about, whether it was used in a homicide or suicide, but I think that any object found in that resort room should have been bagged and tagged immediately without exception. Now, in other news on this day, it was also reported that Justice Secretary Menardo Guevara at that time stated that the DOJ was taking over the investigation into Ong Pin's drug charges, but not into Bree's death. The DOJ, or the Department of Justice, had noticed that this case in general was generating a lot of public interest, so they wanted oversight, I suppose, into the one charge that had more chances of prosecution. It was obviously very disappointing to hear that the DOJ was being selective and they did not want to help solve Bree's death. Now, speaking of investigation, we also learned that the NBI had asked the PNP to share their evidence with them, to which the PNP obliged. Now, you would think that at this point, there were no new reports about Bree's case, but you would be wrong. As the day progressed, reports surfaced about how the police apparently said that they did not know where Ong Pin was, despite being rather confident a few days earlier about how Ong Pin had always made himself available for questioning. There was fear at that point that Ong Pin may have finally left the country. Thankfully, this fear was later allayed as Ong Pin was still confirmed to be in the Philippines. Personally, I was able to let out a sigh of relief knowing that he was still in the Philippines, but the day's news cycle was not over yet. What I found most infuriating about this day's updates was the speculation by Director Peralta that there may have been a third party, supposedly, in Bree and Ong Pin's relationship. That Bree allegedly was pleading with Ong Pin to not leave her for this other woman. Peralta, without offering any solid basis for this speculation, said that this may have been the reason why the couple was heard arguing and why Bree may have wanted to die by suicide, something that her family obviously denied. Peralta then jumped subjects and talked about the CCTV footage from the resort. He basically just described what was going on in that footage. He said that Ong Pin forced his way into the bathroom through the window. He then supposedly found a small ladder and used this to remove the jalousies from the bathroom window in order to gain access. Peralta then said that Ong Pin also destroyed the bathroom door to reach Bree. Many Filipinos were not convinced by this explanation. Commenters quickly speculated that far from wanting to hurt herself in the bathroom, Bree may have tried to hide in it in order to protect herself from Ong Pin. It was suspected that when the resort staff heard fighting and noise from Bree's room, what followed could have been a physical altercation that made Bree flee to the bathroom, where she could then have been followed by Ong Pin, who could have been hell-bent on hurting her. Without any further details from the investigators, these speculations stayed just that, speculations. On the 25th of September, the NBI informed the public that they too conducted a reenactment of what supposedly had happened at the Flotsam and Jetsam resort. They also expressed their plans to conduct a psychological autopsy of Bree, which means that they would be interviewing those closest to her to get a clearer picture of what her mindset and psychological state was before she died. In my blog last year, I questioned whether the NBI were planning to do something similar to Ong Pin, a sort of psychological assessment. Now, whether such an assessment is a standard procedure within Filipino criminal law or not, I do not know, but I would have been so interested to look into the results of such an assessment of Ong Pin. In more somber news, we learned that Bree's remains were flown back before this day, and a short wake was organized at the Cosmopolitan Funeral Home in Davao City. Her burial was then set for the 28th of September 2021. It was also on this day that Miss Sally, Bree's mother, made a public plea to Ong Bin to come forward and shed some light on Bree's death. She also publicly invited him to attend Bree's wake. Now, back in Manila and still on this day, we also heard reports from the PNP and their supposed efforts to track down the source of Ong Bin's drugs that were found in his and Bree's resort room on the 18th of September. I do not think the PNP ever updated the public about this specific investigation, and it feels very much like some PR tactic to put out something positive into the world to divert the public's attention from the fact that they were appearing very biased in this case and heavily in favor of Ong Bin's narrative. At this point in the case as well, we were also told that the PNP had kind of lost sight of Ong Bin. Yet again, he was officially still on bail and therefore needed to be available for questioning at all times. But we were informed that at some point, the PNP had become clueless as to his location, which again was a PR negative for the police authority. The drug inquiry therefore seemed such a convenient thing to announce to deflect from yet another PNP failure. The next day, the 26th of September, was a rather slow news day, but we still learned two things. An article was published on this day that was a tad shocking. Miss Sally gave an interview about how the reports given to her family by the PNP and the reports given to the public through the news outlets did not match at all. She also mentioned that during Bree's autopsy, some organs were not included in the examination and how these organs were now missing. There was no specific information as to where exactly these organs were at that point and which organs exactly were missing. The issue of the missing organs would pop up again a few days later, so let us put a pin on that as well. For now, let's proceed to the 27th of September. On this day, then President Duterte had weighed in on Bree's case as he urged the police agencies involved to look into the case properly and to ensure that justice is served. It was not surprising that the former president said something about the case then, seeing as Bree grew up in Davao City and the media had not failed to point out that connection between the two. I'm sure the president's comments brought more eyes and ears to the case, and it was well-intentioned, but they did little to help the case in general. Staying on the topic of politicians' comments, Gabriela Party List Representative Arlene Brosas also had some words to share, but these were more directed at people who very unsurprisingly had started victim-blaming Bree, therefore perpetuating misogynist views. I had shared in my blog at the start of the case and also on this day last year that the victim-blaming was laughably predictable. Bree did not appear to be your typical demure, shy, and meek Filipina that our society seems to favor, especially if she happens to be a victim of crime as well. Bree looked edgy. Her aesthetic was in direct contrast to the mainstream at that time, and she was comfortable with setting herself apart. She was also confident and stood by how she presented herself to the world. In a society that insists on going with the latest uso or trend, Bree did her own thing and never looked back. Hey Lagim fam, you know I love giving recommendations about other podcasts that I think you should be listening to, right? This time I want to recommend the Picture the Scene podcast hosted by the lovely Andrew and Rachel. I love their podcast because they focus on lesser known crime cases that deserve as much attention as those cases that are always talked about. So make sure that you search for the Picture the Scene podcast on your favorite podcasting platform right now and check out their website as well. I've included their link in the show notes. Okay, now back to the show. And if there's something that society in general, not only Filipino society in general, hates, it is the concept of the other, the concept of someone or something different. We feel threatened by something like that, and we cannot help but demonize that. It's the only way we feel comfortable, having that other and different in our space. Now, moving on from the politicians back to the PNP, we know at this point that the PNP did not know where Ong Pin was, making it clear that they were not keeping an eye on him despite him being still out on bail. The NBI seemed as unbothered as the PNP about not knowing Ong Pin's location, despite saying that they were planning to issue a subpoena. Director Peralta was interviewed on this day as well, but it felt more like a PR junket for Ong Pin because he went on to say that Julian Ong Pin cried intermittently during his interview, and it was Peralta's opinion that he seemed truthful, albeit being depressed. On top of this rather dubious and uninformed diagnosis of depression, Peralta also said that Ong Pin was not coached by his lawyer. The interview he talked about here was presumably the interview Ong Pin attended on the 24th of September, where he was also photographed by members of the media and captured on video leaving the PNP premises in what I presume is La Union. This footage showed Ong Pin walking out into a parking lot with police officers as well as other civilians who I presumed then were his lawyers. In that interview featuring Peralta, we also learned a few new things. For example, we learned that Ong Pin and Bree had known each other for 5 years already before deciding to ultimately become a couple in July 2021. Furthermore, Ong Pin had apparently said that he revealed to Bree that he was going to Europe, and Bree supposedly pleaded with him to not go anywhere and leave her. Again, the PNP expressed that for them, the suicide angle was becoming more and more plausible with each detail they learned in this case. We also learned that a DNA test of whatever was found underneath Bree's nail was being conducted. Results of that DNA test and results of the histopathology examination were still pending at that point. But I also need to note that we never actually got to learn what were in those results because they were never released. Director Peralta also stated that the steel nails on the bathroom door that allegedly caused Ong Pin's injuries to his arms and back were also being tested for DNA. From that same video interview, we were told something again about the issue of reenactments. We were told that in fact, there were several reenactments that were conducted at the crime scene. Now, at this point, I knew about the reenactments conducted by the PNP and the NBI, but this was the first time that I heard about several reenactments being done by the PNP alone. So we learned from this video that the PNP conducted a total of 3 reenactments. They were done on the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of September, and on the last one, they had a woman dangle from the shower curtain rod as if to demonstrate if a person of the same height and weight could indeed hang themselves in that bathroom. This was the reenactment I was talking about earlier in the episode. Again, there was no further information about what the police actually gleaned from these activities. Nothing was released to the public apart from photos that showed members of either the police or the NBI or both posing a female colleague in front of a shower apparatus in that bathroom. Now, you will remember a few seconds I said that this colleague was actually posed and quote-unquote hung from a shower curtain rod. So it would seem to me that the PNP tried a few different scenarios during these reenactments. But even in this one scenario where the female colleague was quote-unquote hanging from the shower apparatus, it looked so awkward because in no way did it even appear like this woman was hanging. She looked like she was just standing there. She would have to kneel down and really let herself dangle from the shower apparatus in order to hurt herself. However, even in that scenario, I believe that there is a great chance that the shower would just break down from the weight of whoever is hanging from it. If you want to see the photos for yourselves, make sure to look for my blog link in the show notes and look for Update 7 on Bree Jonson's case. Now, moving on to other news updates from this day, we learned that GMA News attempted to get an interview with Julian Ongpin, who they said was staying in Itugon, Benguet. But when the TV crew arrived at the Ongpin property there, they were told that Ongpin was not there. Objectively, you could look at this news report and say, not a problem. Julian Ongpin is part of a family that is wealthy and probably has thousands of properties all over the country. He could have just stayed or probably was staying in one of those many properties at that time. But personally, I still felt a tinge of anxiety when I read this because I know that because of the Ongpin family's wealth, Julian also has the money and influence to just step out and fly to a different country if he wanted to. From Itugon, Benguet, we go back to the country's capital where General Eleazar was conducting a video press release. He wanted to respond to the accusations made by the lawyers representing Bree's family. You would remember that the lawyers accused the PNP of having double standards in this case. During this press release, he seemed, well, the best way to describe his demeanor was whiny. He seemed to begrudge that the Jonsons and their lawyers were demanding more and better of the police agency. It was a bit confusing because, at the very minimum, doing more and doing better should be the standard for any police agency. But of course, I digress. He said during this video press release that even though he understood that the lawyers had to say what they said as lawyers of the family, and the family is rightfully upset that this case is still ongoing, he still demanded that the Jonson camp understood and respected that as disciples of the law, the police's focus was to know the truth and to serve justice without biases. Of course, I cannot speak for the Jonson family, but in that regard, I would imagine that they agreed with Eleazar. However, I think the problem with this video press release and this specific statement was that Eleazar seemed to be tone policing the family and policing the way how the family dealt with grief. A public servant, especially a law enforcement officer, does not get to tell the family of a potential murder victim how to grieve and how to hold the police accountable in the face of apparent bias and whitewashing. General Eleazar did not handle this well. If you allow me, I want to say something more about this tone policing issue before I go back to our timeline. This will be a mini rant, so bear with me. It seems to me that people of influence in the Philippines, especially politicians, have a special way of being or becoming defensive when their mistakes or shortcomings are being pointed out to them, or when the people who elected them into office demand they actually do their jobs and do them properly. Politicians proceed to scold and even humiliate Filipinos like abusive parents or partners. It very much feels like politicians are saying, "Be grateful I am giving you something and don't you dare demand more or better." It is very manipulative. For example, as of the time of this recording, we've just heard from a former Chief Justice of our own Supreme Court who gave a statement about the current president's trip to Singapore to attend an F1 race. He shot down any legitimate questions about President Marcos's source of funding for this trip that did not seem to be an official one. Having seen the backlash online and elsewhere, this former judge's response was to appear offended and indignant and tell us, as if we were little children, that the source of funding was irrelevant, even saying that the criticisms of Marcos were insensitive, unnecessary, and irresponsible. It is kind of in the same vein of, "Kayo na nga ang nagkasala, kayo pa ang galit. Kayo na nga ang may utang, kayo pa ang galit kung sisingilin." In English, this is better formed in a question. How are you angry when you're the one who offended and sinned? How are you the one angry when being asked to pay your debt when you're the one who borrowed the money? Let me know if you disagree or agree with this. In the meantime, let's go back to our timeline to the 28th of September. on the 28th of September, Bree Jonson was laid to rest in Davao City. It was either before or after the burial that Miss Sally gave an interview to a few reporters at the cemetery. We learned from her that her lawyers had asked the PNP to file a motion for reconsideration in relation to Ang Pin's release from custody by the La Union Prosecutor's Office. In order for a motion for reconsideration to be triggered, a legal document has to be drafted. In some jurisdictions in the world, this is called a court application, and it may be the same in the Philippines. It is my understanding from Miss Sally's interview that this court application was drafted by her own lawyers and then handed over to the PNP. However, it would seem that these documents were not being paid attention to by the PNP. The family was told that, oddly enough, the PNP did not know what to do with the documents, and so nothing was done, nothing was submitted to the court, therefore risking expiry of the 10-day limit put on such motions. Despite this, it seemed from the interview that the documents were eventually dealt with and the motion was going through the system. So this was good news in the end, but it did give me pause back then, because how could the PNP not know what to do with the documents when these were first handed over to them by Bree's family's lawyers? This was just another thing that worried me about our own police agencies. Now, 2 days later, on the 30th of September, we learned that the DOJ had summoned Julian Ong Bin to Manila as part of the department's preliminary probe. There were footages of him in the media walking either to or from the DOJ building wearing dark glasses, a mask, and what looked like a gray or blue shirt. He was likely questioned not only about the drugs, but also about Bree. At that time, the DOJ did not make any public statement about this interview, and we did not hear anything else afterwards. Benedicto Malcontento, the prosecutor in Ong Pin's drug case, however, said a few words on this day. He confirmed that both the arresting officers and SOCO team involved in this investigation had submitted their supplemental affidavit. Malcontento also confirmed that Ong Bin submitted his own counter affidavit for the original complaint of possession of cocaine, but he also said that Ong Bin and his lawyers requested more time to study the supplemental affidavits submitted by the police. He then said the next preliminary investigation was set for early October, which would then be for the submission of additional counter affidavits. He said if there were no new matters or issues raised by the parties, the case would be submitted for resolution. Remember the issue about the missing organs? Well, we would hear something about that on the 30th of September as well. We learned that these missing organs were supposed to be handed over to the NBI, who, as we know, was scheduled to do an autopsy earlier. That autopsy had since concluded, but the NBI said that they were not able to test these major organs because the PNP had not yet handed them over. General Eleazar was quick to respond a couple of hours later, saying that the organs were going to be handed over imminently. We then heard from the lawyers representing Bree's family. They said that the Jonson family was assured by General Eleazar that he would order the immediate turnover of Bree's organs so the NBI can finally examine them. Over the course of this day, I then reported in my blog how the PNP seemed to have made a complete 180 on the matter because they were suddenly demanding a court order first in order to release the organs. No one knew at this point where the missing organs were, in which state they were in, if they were still viable for further testing by the NBI, or if they had been tampered with or perhaps contaminated. It was utterly bizarre of the PNP to refuse the handover, since it was agreed shortly after Bree was found that the NBI and PNP needed to work together in order to investigate this case. There was no update on this day whether the NBI were filing a counter motion to compel the PNP to surrender the organs to them. Needless to say, this was a very odd and bizarre situation. There would be more updates about the missing organs situation later, but for now, let's go to the 3rd of October. We learned on this day that the NBI was questioning witnesses who interacted with Bree before her death. Sworn statements were being collected as part of the NBI's psychological autopsy of Bree. The NBI also announced that they summoned Julian Ongpin for questioning, which to me appeared like a positive step in the right direction. What was frustrating still as the case approached its first month was the fact that nobody really knew anything specific about the two autopsies conducted. Nevertheless, the PNP never missed the chance to defend itself against things that the Jonson family had said, which in reality were normal worries and concerns. Of the missing organ issue, the PNP, who was said to have asked for a court order first before being willing to release the organs, said that this was a complete misunderstanding. The following is an excerpt from the Manila Times, who reported on this very issue. Quote, "A meeting was also held last week among representatives of the PNP Crime Laboratory, the National Bureau of Investigation, and lawyers of Jonson's family. In the meeting, it was clearly explained that although some of the internal organs were removed, they were immediately returned to the abdominal cavity after tissue samples were taken as part of the protocol in the conduct of autopsy," the PNP chief pointed out. During that meeting, the NBI medico-legal admitted that they have seen the organs, except that they could not decipher or distinguish clearly where the hard tissues are, along with the stomach and trachea, as they were cut into sections to fit the abdominal cavity, Eleazar explained. He also stressed that the matter had already been clarified in the presence of the family's lawyers even before the public statement was made by the family of Bree Jonson on this issue. It appears then that the public statement by the family of Bree Jonson on the alleged missing internal organs stemmed from a misinterpretation of the procedures, but this was already clarified to them, Eleazar said. End of quote. General Eleazar made sure to impress upon the media that all substantial extra organ tissues were handed over to the NBI, who were able to finally scrutinize them as part of their autopsy. When asked about the time it had taken to conduct this investigation and how things seemed to be dragging on, Eleazar insisted that there was no unreasonable delay and the public would be better off avoiding drawing conclusions. This was a peculiar thing to say when the PNP itself had already pretty much concluded this to be a suicide case despite the still ongoing investigations, as he so clearly pointed out. The issue of missing organs continued on the 5th of October. After confidently saying that Bree's family had misunderstood the processes involved in the PNP's autopsy and handling of body tissues and also the turnover of organs, it would seem that the inevitable rift between the police authorities and the Jonson family continued. The law offices of Sunga, Salandanan, and Ampuan issued a statement on this day. They stated unequivocally that there was no misunderstanding. Here is what was in that statement verbatim, and please note that there is at least one very graphic bit, so a minor trigger warning here. In part, the statement read, quote, "To note, on the 20th of September 2021, PNP Region 1 conducted the first autopsy of Bree. Per admission of Dr. Ariel De Vera of the PNP Region 1 Crime Lab, he removed the organs from the body, including the trachea, to get sample slices as part of the evidence. On the 23rd of September 2021, in connection with its parallel investigation, the NBI conducted the second autopsy of Bree, where it was declared that some major organs of Bree Jonson were missing, specifically the trachea, heart, and stomach. Immediately thereafter, we sent a request to the PNP Region 1 Crime Lab and PNP National Crime Lab for the release of these major organs for the turnover to the NBI. On the 28th of September, we were relentlessly calling the PNP Crime Lab to follow up with our request. On the 29th of September, we finally got in touch with P. Gen Eleazar, General Eleazar and was able to ask him the status of our request. He said that he will look into it. On the 1st of October, we received a letter via email from General Pascual Munoz Jr., the director of the PNP Crime Lab, denying our request for the return and/or turnover of the organs. According to General Munoz, the PNP will not release the organs without a court order. On the same day, the mother of Bree, Miss Salome Jonson, personally reached out to General Eleazar, urging for the release of the organs. General Eleazar eventually granted Miss Jonson's request and instructed the PNP Crime Lab to coordinate with the NBI for the proper turnover of the organs. Clearly, Bree's family was well aware of the situation. It was because of PNP's initial stance not to release the organs without a court order that made Bree's grieving family publicly seek for help. It was only after Mrs. Jonson urged General Eleazar on the propriety of turning over the organs and after public pressure was apparent that the instruction to release them were made. When General Eleazar instructed on releasing the organs, no other statement on this issue was made by the family. End of quote. Together with this statement, the law firm also included a photo of the court order request made by the PNP. As the young ones these days would say, the Jonson family came with receipts. Apart from this statement by the law firm, Miss Sally also commented on the issue. Miss Sally, who I understand worked or still works as a veterinarian in Canada, understands histopathology. She commented on what she perceived as problematic practice in handling her daughter's organs. She said, quote, "The organs have been cut up. I question this procedure of the PNP. The NBI is still not done with their autopsy, therefore the PNP should not have done this. Now, the NBI is trying to figure out the bits and pieces of my daughter's organs. They cannot talk down to me and imply that I do not understand such things. If the organs are missing, then there is obviously a flaw in their procedure. What I don't understand is why you are denying the fact that you initially withheld the organs and asked us to file a court order as stated in your letter, and then only to find out that all it takes is a simple text message from me to grant our request." End of quote. With the release of the missing organs to the NBI, this issue was finally put to bed, which leads us to the next day, the 6th of October. You probably remember me mentioning something about the NBI issuing a subpoena for Julian Ongpin. Well, news came out on this day about how Ongpin had supposedly already submitted himself for an interview with the NBI as a response to that subpoena. He was supposedly escorted by not one but 3 lawyers to answer questions by investigating agents. This interview had apparently taken place 2 days before, so the 4th of October. It was said that Ongpin was interviewed for 3 hours. After this interview, and I do not know how soon after, but apparently a second subpoena was then sent to Ongpin for further questioning. However, what was truly audacious was that Ongpin's lawyers said that Ongpin was apparently not keen on answering further questions anymore. A quote from one of his lawyers, Vicente Verdadero, read, quote, "Without being disrespectful to Department Order Number 224/2021, we wish to manifest that in view of the earlier September 28 subpoena, which Mr. Ongpin heeded to yesterday, and whose purpose he complied with fully by answering completely all questions propounded to him by your personnel from Manila head office, Mr. Ongpin has satisfied the NBI subpoena. Therefore, the second subpoena is no longer required." End of quote. I could not find a response made by the NBI in response to this statement. I also cannot be sure if Ongpin had not turned up to this second interview that the NBI wanted to do with him, so for now that remains a mystery. 2 days later, on the 8th of October, I came across some news reports from sources that I was not really familiar with. In my blog, I warned that one should take what was written in these reports with a grain of salt because no other bigger and more reputable news outlets had actually reported the same things, nor was anything confirmed by the police or Bree's family. One news outlet claimed to have tidbits of Ong Pin's police statement. He supposedly stated that he and Bree had made love in the early morning hours of the 18th. Afterwards, Ong Pin, for whatever reason, became upset and insecure about Bree's past relationships. He wanted to get out of the room to get some air and to smoke a cigarette. Bree then supposedly asked him to come back into their room, but he refused. After a while, he apparently got the sense that Bree was not in their room anymore. It is not clear to me what gave this away for him. Ong Pin then supposedly decided to enter the room and saw that Bree was not there, which then led him to believe that she was in the bathroom, thus leading to the supposed bathroom rescue he told the police about. There was another report from this day that explored Ong Pin's supposed statement about Bree's use of certain substances. According to him, Bree had supposedly used tranquilizers, antidepressants, and stabilizers. Specifically, Ong Pin had supposedly disclosed that Bree took a substance called lamotrigine, which in my understanding is an anticonvulsant. Nobody else seemed to have picked up these two reports on that day, so for the purposes of this podcast, I will not further comment or elaborate on anything that was said in those reports because there was no confirmation from anyone at all about the veracity of these statements. So let's turn to other updates or reports that were released on this day. The NBI released a quick update about their findings from surveying the crime scene in La Union. In a way, the NBI threw a big wrench into Ong Pin's many contradicting statements about what Bree had actually used to hang herself from the shower head in the bathroom. Now, you will probably remember that in one of his statements, he said Bree had used a bra strap to allegedly end her life, after which this bra strap snapped and ended up being torn. In another statement, Ong Pin had supposedly said that it was a cat chain. Now, the NBI did not find any torn bra strap or any missing bra at all from their inventory of Bree's things. Now, given the past reports on the PNP's crime scene investigation, we were somehow given the impression that the PNP found either a bra strap or a cat chain or both at the crime scene. However, for whatever weird reason, we were also told that both the bra strap and the cat chain were not even bagged or tagged as part of the PNP's evidence inventory. So there are two options here. Either the PNP completely failed in their duty to be thorough in gathering evidence from the crime scene, or those two things, the bra strap and the cat chain, never actually existed. I would even argue that there may be a third option. Maybe those things were present, but they were deliberately left out. But again, this is just my speculation. Now, staying on this theme about contradictions, another report on this day stated that contrary to what Ong Pin said about there being no altercation between him and Bree, someone did call the police authorities specifically because they heard and noticed a commotion in the couple's resort room. This person who called the police was the same person, a staff member, who entered the room just before the police arrived and found Bree's body on the bed and also noticed how the room was in such a disarray. I suppose this report was trying to say that despite the minimization made by Ong Pin in his statements, there was very much an altercation and something negative happening in that room just before Bree died. Now, going back to the NBI and their investigation, we've heard tidbits of their investigation before. We then learned on this day that, in fact, they have already closed their preliminary investigation, but we never heard what the full results were. And yes, we could be upset about the fact that the NBI never shared their results to the public and through the media, but this pales in comparison to the biggest piece of news from this day. Reports surfaced on this day about two people in high positions within the Ong Bin business empire. Specifically, these reports talked about how the NBI had subpoenaed two executives of Alpha Land and Balisin Island Club, whose help was sought by Julian Ong Bin on the morning Bree died. It was reported that the NBI issued subpoenas to Alpha Land corporate officer Natalie Manalo Dalupan and Balisin Island Club executive Michael Asperin, a retired Navy general. As you know, Alpha Land and Balisin Island Club are both owned by the Ong Bin family. The subpoenas were triggered by something that Ong Bin had apparently said in his interview with the NBI. He said that on the morning when Bree died, he called up Manalo Dalupan and Asperin. Ong Bin then got Asperin on the line and handed the phone over to San Juan La Union Police Chief Major Gerardo Macaraeg. Per Ong Bin, he got the pair to talking as he pleaded for them to check Bree's pulse. There is not much else in these reports, but I found this so bizarre and I don't quite know what to do with this information. I just know that it does not seem standard police procedures to just take a call from a suspect's father's high-ranking employee to talk about God knows what whilst an active crime scene investigation is or was going on. It just does not sit right. I guess I'm just wondering whether someone who does not have the kind of wealth that Julian Ong Bin has would be afforded the same patience and grace whilst standing in an active crime scene. At this point in this case's lifespan, everybody just wished for some good news, and there was some good news on the 18th of October on the first death anniversary of Bree Jonson. On this day, the 18th of October, the prosecutors over at the La Union Prosecutor's Office had decided to indict Ong Bin for drug possession. An indictment is usually the result of a multi-step process that starts with an inquest or preliminary investigation by the prosecutors. This is then followed by a resolution which contains the findings of said investigation. The prosecutors have the discretion to either dismiss the complaint that led to the investigation or find probable cause to file charges. This then becomes the indictment. It is not a charge in and of itself. It is simply signaling that there is potential cause for a charge further down the line. Unfortunately, or maybe also fortunately, an indictment can be appealed. After the initial collective sigh of relief we had when news came out that Ong Bin would be indicted, we learned on the 22nd of October that there was still no warrant for his arrest. This brought to the fore a very stark contrast to the many drug-related raids in the poorer areas of the Philippines where people were being brutally and systematically killed with impunity. And yet, the scion of a wealthy and influential family who was found with 12.6 grams of cocaine could not even be properly indicted. The war on drugs did and does not seem to apply to him. Despite this disappointing news, it would seem that on this day, Ong Bin's case was nevertheless raffled off, which simply means being allocated to a court and judge. This judge was Judge Romeo Agasita in the La Union Regional Trial Court branch. Agasita had the task of determining whether there was probable cause for the issuance of an arrest order for Ong Bin. 2 days later, on the 24th of October, Ong Bin's lawyers asked the court to dismiss the case against their client or at the very least defer his arrest. Ong Bin's lawyers argued that there was not enough evidence to establish probable cause, a shocking and slightly audacious thing to say given there were literally 12.6 grams of cocaine in his possession. The lawyers said that the drugs were not in the actual possession, meaning Ong Bin was not literally holding the cocaine pouch, or the possession cannot be directly and actually attributed to him. Ong Pin's lawyers argued that there was a leap in logic and the evidence was judicially unacceptable because there was a demonstrable absence of any proof that the drugs were in Julian Ong Pin's possession, dominion, or control. There was only a mere constructive possession, as in it was presumed that Ong Pin possessed the drugs because it was found in his and Bree's resort room. It was a bit jarring to read this statement from Ong Pin's lawyer, so I was curious as to what was actually written in the applicable law. The applicable law here is the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002. I was then curious to know whether the term possession is defined within this legislation. As it turns out, it's not. Now, any lawyer worth their salt, in my opinion, would know that this means the term should be defined by its common dictionary meaning, i.e., what a reasonable person would think possession means. If a reasonable person walked into Ong Pin and Bree's room that night and saw that Ong Pin was the only person alive, it does not take a 5-year-old child to deduce that the many packets or pouches of drugs could belong to either Ong Pin or Bree or both. The prosecution does not have to prove without a reasonable doubt yet who really owned the drugs for the purpose of the indictment. That only applies in a trial. We are merely talking about a probable cause for arrest. The question therefore becomes, is it probable that Ong Pin could own those drugs? And the answer, for me at least, is yes, because there were only 2 people inside that room that night and morning. Now, having said all that, let's stay on the topic of the drugs recovered from the crime scene. At some point that day, some people on Facebook saw pictures that were posted and they seemed to depict different bags and pouches that were allegedly recovered from the crime scene at the Flotsam and Jetsam resort the morning Bree died. It looked to many netizens that the pouches had logos on them of a wellness center called Aigle or Aigle Wellness Center, which, funnily enough, is or was owned by the Ong Pins. Now, I don't want to spend any more time on these pictures that were seen on Facebook, but it does make me think. If these photos on Facebook are legitimate, then one could say that Ong Pin's lawyers were trying very hard to use a potential loophole in the law to get their client's drug case thrown out. If the pictures are not legitimate, then there is a perhaps concerted or maybe not concerted effort here to distract the people from the real issues in this case by using fake news and other forms of disinformation. Leaving this issue behind, we now proceed to the 14th of November. On this day, we learned that Ong Pin's lawyers lodged a petition claiming that the police failed to observe rules covering the handling of evidence in the wake of what happened at the Flotsam and Jetsam resort. His lawyers claimed that there was a violation of the chain of custody rule, which apparently requires the presence of either the accused, their representative or counsel, an elective public official, a representative of the National Prosecution Service, or a media representative when processing the crime scene. The same article closed with yet another familiar position by the Ong Pin legal team, in that firstly, Ong Pin was not in possession of the drugs, and secondly, people should be blaming Bree. Meanwhile, on the other side of things, the NBI seemed to still be busy with their own investigation. It was reported on this day that the Bureau purchased a life-size mannequin that corresponded to the height and weight of Bree at the time of her death. The NBI wanted to recreate Bree's alleged suicide as per Julian Ong Pin's statement. There was a comment then made by the Jonson family lawyer that with this aspect of the NBI investigation now done, things seemed to be clearer. There was not much of a follow-up explanation as to what these things were, or what it was that was clearer, or what the result was of this mannequin test. So yet again, we were left in the dark. By the 15th of November, the court in La Union decided to dismiss all drug charges against Julian Ong Pin. In a nutshell, the court agreed with Ong Pin's lawyers when they argued that the chain of custody rule was breached when evidence was handled at the Flotsam and Jetsam Resort on the 18th of September. This was very disappointing, especially when one learns that a lot of detainees facing similar drug charges usually get off due to a violation of this rule, as prosecutors fail to show and prove the integrity of the corpus delicti, or evidence of the crime. However, such a violation of the chain of custody rule is usually brought up during trial and not in a motion to dismiss. When I posted about this news on my blog, I thought that this was quite an important aspect of this case and should therefore form part of the prosecution's motion for reconsideration, but the prosecution never filed one. This raised many questions. Did the prosecution simply give up? Did they think that this was too much of an effort with not a lot of prospect for success? Or were they intimidated to just not fight this case any further? We will never know. By the 26th of November, the DOJ asked the court in La Union to reconsider its dismissal of charges for possession of illegal drugs against Ong Pin. A hearing was then scheduled for early December. And just to be clear here, I never actually found any news report about what the result of that hearing was. So if you don't hear about it any further in this episode, that's the reason why. On the 5th of December, the case suffered yet another setback when the NBI informed the public that the investigation into Bree's death had now stalled. The NBI stated that they have made an application for a search warrant to secure further forensic evidence, but that the judge assigned to the case was at that time on leave. The application therefore was just sitting there and waiting to be approved. I do not think there was ever any movement in this particular aspect of the case. Furthermore, the NBI also stated that they were waiting for the PNP to give them clarification as to that DNA test the PNP apparently had planned on conducting or had already conducted. This was unclear then and remains unclear now. It was also around this time that the PNP stated that they were reviewing the drug charges against Ong Pin, the ones that were dropped by the court in La Union due to, as the judge said, non-compliance to the chain of custody rule in relation to the handling of illegal drugs. There's still no update on this particular matter to this very day. And the bad news just kept rolling in. On the 8th of December, the PNP announced that Julian Ong Pin was not considered a person of interest in the investigation into Bree's death anymore. Of course, the Jonson family reacted and their lawyer made a statement saying, quote, "Contrary to prior statements circulating on social media, the initial medico-legal report of Ilocos Training and Regional Medical Center showed signs of struggle. There were bruises found in some other parts of Brianna's body other than her neck." End of quote. This statement was probably made to drive home the point that this case potentially not only involved a death by strangulation, but also someone who was beaten up badly by the only other person in the room. But of course, I'm only speculating. Now, going back to our timeline, we are now at the 15th of October. The National Bureau of Investigation said that they obtained a copy of the surveillance footage showing Bree's last moments with Ong Pin. A La Union court approved the NBI's petition for a search warrant to retrieve the CCTV footage of the couple from the hostel management from the 18th of September. The NBI said that the CCTV footage showed Bree and Ong Pin in a heated altercation outside their resort room a few hours before Bree was found unconscious. This is probably the part of the same footage that was released earlier that year showing Bree and Ong Pin smoking and drinking outside their room. But remember that back then we were given the impression that we were only being shown a partial bit of that footage. I am assuming now that the NBI may have gotten their hands on the complete footage. This all now brings us to the new year, 2022. On the 7th of January, it was weird to read that the NBI only now had started probing the CCTV footage that I just mentioned. This was the reason they really did not tell us anything back then, because they did not do anything with the footage. Now, on a completely different note, it would seem that the PNP still had not provided the NBI with a clarification about their DNA tests, and I think the situation still has not changed. By the 23rd of February, we learned that Congresswoman Arlene Brosas questioned the PNP chief's connection to the Ong Pins because news reports came out that day about PNP chief Leonardo Carlos going on a trip to the luxurious Balisin Island owned by the Ong Pin family. News about the chief's trip only became public because he confirmed that a helicopter that was supposed to pick him up from the island crashed and killed a member of the police. Something disturbing in and of itself, I would say. The chief's actions naturally raised a lot of eyebrows because it seemed like a conflict of interest. Brosas, in reference to the trip, asked this question in her speech at Congress, quote, "Is this the reward for fumbling with Bree Jonson's case at the onset?" End of quote. Is it indeed? The PNP chief slammed the claims linking him to Bree's case. He said the investigation commenced before he was appointed PNP chief and that his trip was not for the purpose of meeting up with the Ong Pins. Not really a good reason, if you ask me. At the very bare minimum, appearances are very important when you hold such a public office. Even if he did not do anything wrong, the implication is always there, and that is already very problematic. The thing is, we will never know what transpired on this trip on that island, and it will just forever sit uncomfortably in our collective consciousness. Just another line for our tally board of questionable things that the PNP tends to do. After this date, there's nothing new about Bree's case. However, from all this sadness and tragedy emerged something good, if you will. A foundation was established in Bree's name. I will place a link to the foundation in the show notes. On the website, it says, quote, "A series of fundraising affairs to pursue the incorporation of the Bree Jonson Advocacy and Foundation and begin programs rooted in Jonson's personal causes are set to take place in 2022, with its founders seeking support and patronage for its sustenance and longevity." End of quote. If you want to help the foundation, you can make a PayPal donation directly through their website, or you can help amplify their message by sharing their link on social media. And this is where I end this rather long review of what we know so far about Bree's case. I don't know what else this year can bring to this case or what next year has in store for us. I try not to think of how this case can potentially remain unsolved because I've seen some truly cold cases being revived even decades later, ensuring that justice was served after all. I'm hoping the same will happen to this case. Lagim fam, thank you for listening to this bonus episode. Season 4 is coming, I promise. I'm just currently finding myself in a lot of new situations with a new job and the possibility of having to move out of my current apartment. So if there is even more delay, note that it is not because I do not want to produce episodes anymore. It is merely life getting in my way of podcasting. Thank you again for all your support and keep sharing my Lagim and Asia in the Shadows episodes to anyone who might find the episodes interesting. Thank you again. Daghang salamat at mabuhay.